Welcome everyone to the stream. Welcome Chris to the stream. Happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me on, Has.
All right, so I guess the purpose of this live stream was to kind of just talk about your concept of vegan 2.0, which I have kind of looked a little bit into what it kind of entails. So I think maybe if you're fine with it, I think a good place to start might be for me to summarize my understanding of it and then see if maybe I have any misconceptions about it and kind of go from there.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So the way that I understand this concept is basically not just focusing on excluding animal harm from our lives, from our consumer choices, but kind of orienting ourselves toward prevention of animal harm. And then also, I guess, like entailed by that and kind of by extension of that, a focus on effective activism.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's pretty much spot on.
Okay, great. So I've seen you say that some people misunderstand this as a utilitarian concept. I'm wondering, I guess, why you think that might come about and what your response to that kind of a criticism might be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not necessarily that it's not utilitarian, but I think that the criticism of the vegan 2.0 position as being because it's utilitarian, I don't think is exactly correct. I think that if you had rights-based ethics or anything else, you, to the extent that you're still concerned about the scale, you are still going to be aligned with most of what I'm talking about with respect to vegan 2.0. So I think that some people imagine that if you have a deontological approach or rights-based ethics, that all sense of scale goes out of the window and you just get black and white, right and wrong. But I mean, as long as you still think it's worse to kill two chickens than it is to kill one chicken, you're still concerned with scale to some extent. And so I think you can talk about, more rights violations or uh, rights being violated to a greater degree and things like that. So even if you think of it in terms of animal rights instead of, utilitarianism, suffering, welfare, whatever you might want to say, I still think it makes sense to focus on helping as many animals as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that yeah, I think both, a utilitarian concept and a deontological rights base, et cetera, no matter, even if you're coming at it from virtue ethics, I think they're all scalable, which is kind of the beauty of veganism. What I'm wondering is, as someone who wants to effectively advocate for animals and who doesn't want to just exclude animals from my consumption alone, but wants to, help prevent more harm from happening to other animals by advocating for non-vegans to go vegan and, minimize or ideally eliminate their consumption as well. Am I already vegan 2.0, I guess, would be my question. And maybe I don't even know it.
Maybe so, yes. I mean, in one sense, you could say it's just sort of activism rebranded, right? And in a way, yeah, that's not wrong. It is mainly talking about going beyond, exactly as you said, excluding animal exploitation and cruelty, as a vegan society puts it, or animal suffering, or however else you might want to think about, what the precise bad thing is, excluding, as it is in the definition of veganism 1.0, as I say, right, conventional veganism, traditional veganism, to preventing in vegan 2.0. So it really is a switch to thinking about, most of the animals that you can affect are not animals that you would have eaten, right? They're animals that other people would have eaten, perhaps, right? I think that really it's about saying, listen, if you've gone vegan, that's great, but it really is just the beginning. It's getting to zero. A lot of people think of it as, right? And part of why I like the idea of vegan 2.0 is because it's actually very difficult to get to exactly zero, right? When we talk about, medicines that have a little bit of milk powder, and I'm still going to take the medicine if I need it and stuff like that. And some vegans I see really, getting upset about this and losing sleep over it because they had a trace amount of whatever it might be. And I'm not saying that you should have a flippant attitude towards those instances, but it's just like trying to save a few pennies when you could be investing thousands of pounds. It's just a lot of vegans seem to lose the sense of scale when you get fixed in on the getting closest to zero part. You can never actually quite get to zero, and so you just do increasingly larger sacrifices to make increasingly smaller gains.
Yeah.
Whereas if you expand your view and say,
Oh no. Uh-oh.
you can
Chris
go
is
beyond
frozen.
just trying to reduce my own footprint, the animals that I would have been harming.
Chris froze again. Uh-oh.
Then you can clearly.
Chris, I don't know if you can hear me.
Am I back?
We lost your video and the audio is kind of like barely coming through.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Okay, now
Maybe
video
me
is back.
recording is messing it up. And we'll just. Right, let's stop this.
Okay, I can see you again. It's just kind of like freezing. Like maybe I'll see motion for like 2 seconds and then it kind of freezes again for like 10 seconds.
Hello, am I back?
I can see and hear you, but yeah, it's just kind of it might be a little bit better now. I think the video is freezing. Are you able to hear me, Chris? Maybe if I don't think it's an issue on my end. I don't know if anybody in the chat is having any issues seeing me. Uh-oh. Okay, Chris, can you hear me? Oh man, okay, I see this. Okay, Chris, I think you're back.
Am I back?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I think that my computer is struggling if I try and record on OBS. I've turned off my OBS. Hopefully that's going to help.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's good now. I was having kind of like I was getting dropouts of video and then the audio was kind of coming through intermittently. But I guess we're back now. But I caught the gist of most of what you were saying with regard to kind of like increasing levels of inconvenience for kind of like diminishing returns when we go to certain I guess ends to reduce our contribution to animal exploitation. I think something that comes to mind is, for example, like if I use the loo, right? I think that's what you guys call it, right? to go to the bathroom.
Good English.
Then if there's like, a soap dispenser, I'm going to use the soap to wash my hands. I don't know if it has maybe stearic acid in it from animals. I don't know if it has some kind of palm oil derivative, which I try not to buy, in my own consumption. But it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, I need to wash my hands. I could carry some kind of like a travel vegan soap with me. Maybe I should, honestly, but that seems like a little bit of maybe kind of like diminishing returns type of inconvenience.
Exactly. Yeah, it's diminishing returns, and I mean, yeah, that's a great example. There's so many things like that where there is some amount of animal product consumption or use that is really unavoidable. There was a thing a few years ago in the UK when they updated the banknotes, and our £5 note, and I think now our £20 note as well, um, and the 10, I guess, is sort of weird, like plastic that it used to be paper, like your guys' notes, and now it's some sort of weird plastic that apparently has a small percentage of something from a cow, tallow or something like that, I guess. And that's an example of something where I have to use money, right? I can't boycott cash, so I am going to have to handle a certain amount of. I mean, well, frankly, right? People are not using cash that much these days anyway. But there's obviously going to be certain things where it's like basically impossible to boycott, even though it has some amount of animal product or animals are implicated in its production or something like that. So it is ultimately going to be a game of trying to do as much as practical and possible as the vegan society definition says, but that's going to be subjective, right? How much really is practical and possible is going to be up for debate, and people could say, well, you could always go one step further, but you're going to drive yourself crazy playing that game if the prize that you get to win is being the closest to zero. Whereas on the other side, for vegan 2.0, the more that you do and the more that you obsess over it, and I am a obsessive guy, I like to get really into this and think, okay, how can I maximize this further? And I feel that some people could be that way with respect to conventional veganism and minimizing them as much as possible. And there's just more animals to be helped in obsessing over what you can do more and more. Activism, donating, sharing things on social media, speaking up, I think is just huge. Our social fabric is just the sum of what all of us say. And yeah, those things are going to help far more animals than what you eat personally, frankly. Like, we just don't, compared to the amount of animals that you can help by doing activism, donating, and particularly doing it well and effectively, the number of animals that an average meat eater eats is just not that many. So the effect, the number of animals that you help by going vegan, therefore, you can help many, many times more animals again by going vegan 2.0.
Would you say that like it kind of, I guess, how can I say this? Like, pragmatically speaking, the effect that your choices have on real life animals is more important than the idea of feeling like you're not exploiting animals, or maybe even necessarily setting an example of not exploiting animals. For example, there's this, I don't know if you're familiar with Feathergate, but there was this whole kind of like, I don't know if you call it an uproar, but just some kind of controversy on YouTube about the idea of picking up a fallen feather and whether that would kind of constitute exploitation, and whether
Right.
somebody who would pick up a feather and use it for something like, I don't know, maybe trying to think of like putting in a vase in their house or something like that, if that would constitute, an exploitative practice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think, people who are on the side that, yeah, I mean, you can pick up a fallen feather, you're not exploiting anybody, um, have been met with a lot of backlash by certain vegans claiming that, well, no, you're still using them as a product. You still haven't broken out of this mindset or mentality that animals' bodies are ours to use and instrumentalize, etc. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think there's a classic example of something which is just like completely pointless to get distracted by. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there might be some entertainment value basically in having like a philosophical conversation about, well, technically would it count as exploitation if the feather's fallen off the bird, and then if you use the feather for some instrumental purpose, is that exploitation? It's an academically maybe interesting conversation for people who are really into talking about those technicalities of different ethical systems and stuff like that, but it doesn't help animals. It just doesn't. That's not helping any animals. And the thing that I often think about is what kind of topics would I try to amplify if I was a double agent from the meat industry and trying to distract vegans and get them spending their time and attention on stuff which isn't really going to hurt my profits as a factory farmer, let's say. And stuff like this is like right up there because, like,
Yeah.
seriously, it just doesn't matter. Pick up the feather, don't pick up the feather. Give a shit. Like it's not affecting very many animals at all. It really is affecting loads and loads of animals if you do. But the thing is, it's quite kind of on one level repetitive, the kind of stuff that I talk about, because it's basically like give money to these like dozen charities, share pro animal stuff on social media, and we basically know what that consists of, and speak up and talk about things and do organized activism. It's not that entertaining in the same way that it could be, you know, a more contentious philosophical conversation to go into the feather thing, but like it just doesn't. It's just not interesting to me because it doesn't seem to help any animals. Yeah, another final thing I'll say on that: there are some vegans who really like being vegan as a social identity and like being in this minority club, and uh, like maybe, you know, and I like this as a vegan, right? Getting to feel morally superior to other people, right? Who amongst us doesn't enjoy that? But that's not the main point, right? The main point is actually to help as many animals as possible. So you get people who want it to be a social club, and you get people who want it to be a social movement and to grow. And I want to get to the stage where, you know, I'm not in an exclusive club of vegans because that's grown to such an extent that it's not an interesting thing anymore, right? So yeah, I think we can. It's very easy for us to get our attention sucked into these small fry issues, essentially, where there's much bigger things at stake, but it's just kind of it's straightforward, so it's not that interesting to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. I think there is some, you know, to some extent, I think a mindset shift is what we want to see in people. I think there is a danger of falling into thinking that veganism is essentially like a consumerist choice, and that our spending is kind of the only determinant of whether or not animals are liberated from exploitation by humans. So I do think that, you know, to some extent, we need to be thinking about different rights violations. You know, like something that I talk about is with dogs, for example, like in the sterilization of dogs, which I think is problematic in and of itself. You know, it's not a calculation that people make without sacrificing bodily autonomy of dogs. You know, obviously it's to prevent suffering, you know, future dogs, that kind of thing. But like, they're not given vasectomies, for example. They're actually their testicles are removed, for example, during the sterilization. Like if we're talking about males. So yeah, I think there are a lot of instances where animal ethics, vegan ethics, kind of play a part from a strictly, you know, mindset based perspective. Like, you know, how do we view other animals? I think there's a lot of things that I think are entailed, even like, you know, bringing other animals into the fold socially, thinking of them as like he and she instead of like an it, for example, or using they pronouns. I do think it's important to kind of like bring veganism into the fold of social justice rather than viewing it as like just a consumeristic calculus. But yeah, I do think that it kind of, you know, there can be a point where we end up in kind of a purity spiral if we're barring people from calling themselves vegan, or even like, you know, excluding people from the vegan movement, from, you know, excluding whatever that means, you know, but excluding people, um, or trying to cancel people, let's say, if they
Mm-hmm.
don't agree with, you know, certain political ideologies and things like that, like human rights related things.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's another classic example of something that you would do if you were trying to sabotage the movement. right? You would try to amplify wedge issues. That's a classic thing that you do in politics, try to amplify wedge issues on the other side. So you try to say, again, if I was the nefarious, moustache twirling factory farm lobbyist trying to work out how to scatter the vegan movement and make them ineffective, I would want to get them fighting with each other about things that are not really going to be that relevant, and now they're not spending attention fighting me, right? So I think another thing that you would want to do is reduce as much as possible the number of people who are in this group called vegan activists by insisting that if you are in that group, you have to meet all sorts of other criteria. So let's get the meta out there and make vegans think and repeat, and you will get good faith vegans who end up repeating these things that are bad faith but out there. You can't properly be vegan unless you're in favor of XYZ other issue, and if you're not going to be accepted. I mean, I don't really mind if there is backlash, or if people say that I've said the wrong thing or whatever. Like, it's not that, it's fine, right? It's just not that deep. Lots of people on the vegan Reddit, for example, are, I think Reddit is a great example because it's like an echo chamber machine, basically. It's like orient people around something that they agree on, and then you can essentially ban things that don't agree with that. It creates an echo, which there's a place for that. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's very functional, and I like the vegan Reddit spaces in general. But certainly there is something where the message that there's actually something that you can do which is much better than veganism to help animals is not necessarily going to be warmly received, because that's the whole identity and everything like that, right? So again, it goes back to that goes back to the identity point. But I think that the other things that you said about we want people to have to cross over with social justice and other related concepts, and for people, what did you say about some of the people don't think of the right reason or something along those lines?
Basically just that, I think it's important not to think of veganism as strictly a matter of consumerist choices, but also just
Right.
in terms of like other choices that reflect a mindset shift where we're challenging human supremacy.
Right, with the language and everything like that. Yeah. So I think with that stuff, I agree, but only in a sort of instrumental way. I think, it's good, for example, that PETA thing that they had about like don't have speciesist language and don't say put all your eggs in one basket and stuff like that. I'm kind of like, fine. I mean, there might be something in there about, when you kind of objectify animals through like habitual language use, it changes mindset and stuff like that. For me, there would have to be some sort of line that could be drawn between that and more animals getting knives in their throats, right? That's ultimately what we're talking about, animals getting killed. And I don't think that some of the stuff that we could get distracted by is like anywhere near as important. There was a great thing in the UK, in a UK supermarket, where they had a Christmas card with some cute little pigs with Santa hats, and they're in the snow. And one of the pigs says to the other, don't worry, I hear that we're getting blankets this year. And there was a whole thing, pigs in blankets, right? And it was a whole thing about, vegans got offended by this. And I think the supermarket even ended up apologizing. What were we doing getting upset about the Christmas card when they had actual pigs like in the next aisle, like bits of chopped up pig? I mean, it's just so, it's something that would be very easy to get distracted by. And I think a little bit of my tinfoil hat on here, that such distractions are surely manufactured in order to have people go after them in such a way, right? Again, if you're the factory farm lobbyist, one of the things that you would want to do is get the vegans disagreeing on these wedge issues where you're going to get people taking either side and arguing with each other and falling out and saying that people aren't real vegans or whatever it may be, right? You're rubbing your hands together with the factory farm lobbies in those situations. So I think there's two things. Like, one, like, don't be a dick to other people who are clearly trying to be helpful and go in the right direction. There might be things that people are doing ineffectively or could be done better, and perhaps you can help people to do that, right? But if people are clearly doing something with good intentions and in the right direction, I think being encouraging mutually on that is worthwhile. And then the other thing is, and I'm sure that you have learned this lesson as a small content creator, as have I. Don't worry if people are a dick to some extent, right? It doesn't matter if you get backlash or if you get negative comments or whatever. Like, it's fine. Life goes on. It doesn't, like, that's just fine. It really is just fine. I think that needs to land for people, because so many vegans in particular would be much, much more vocal if they could just get that. It's fine. If you post a vegan thing and someone comments bacon, though, it's fine. That's fine. You don't have to respond to it. You can just either delete it or just ignore it. It's fine if people disagree with you, or if people even start commenting, say, oh, this is elitist and this is classist or whatever. That's fine. They're allowed to think that. It's fine. You're not cancelled. You're not banned. You're not, right. Life goes on. People disagree with each other all the time. So that's the other thing with vegan 2.0. Like, I think it's a better system than vegan 1.0. But it's fine if some people don't think that, right? If some people really are like, I'm just locked in on excluding exploitation. It really is all about me not consuming stuff. If some people want to just maximize for that completely and say bollocks to everything else, like, that's fine, right? I'd prefer if they did my thing, because I think it's going to help more animals, but it doesn't affect me. It doesn't. And I want vegans to, hear this. Don't be put off from saying what you think is right by people disagreeing with you, because that's life.
Yeah, I think to me, I guess my perception of this concept seems like perhaps it might be a little bit superfluous, just in terms of, like, if it's more or less synonymous with effective, like becoming an effective activist. I'm kind of failing to see the nuance, or kind of like what the distinguishing. I guess I'm wondering kind of like what would be the requirements for one to pass as vegan 2.0. Like, could they for example be someone who's like still eating animals unnecessarily? I guess, like, I think you had said that maybe vegan 1.0 is not a prerequisite, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think so. The definition that I've put vegan 2.0 is uh, an adapted version of the vegan 1.0 definition, where I've changed excluding. There's three parts that I changed. I'm trying to remember them all now. Excluding, as far as practical and possible, becomes preventing as efficiently and effectively as possible. Oh yeah, and then it's all animal suffering to the worst forms, or something like that, which again reflects that it's just a prioritization problem, right? It's like triage. If you're in a medical profession, you have to, like, choose what's the most important patient that needs fixing. If someone's got a broken back, they're more important than somebody who's got a sprained wrist, right? So that's the kind of concept that I'm getting at there. Now, to the question, would someone need to be vegan 1.0 in order to be vegan 2.0? Technically not. You could do the things that I talk about in vegan 2.0 whilst eating animal products, and you would be, in my estimation, helping more animals than somebody who was following a vegan diet, let's say, but not doing the things that I talk about in vegan 2.0. I do both. I think that most people who are interested in the kind of thing that I talk about would do both. And the reason that I framed it as vegan 2.0 is to reflect that, just because it reflects my assumption that, well, most of the people who are going to be interested in helping animals as effectively as possible probably are going to be vegans. But I know that there's other framings of essentially the same concept, right? So Farm Kind, I spoke to the guy from Farm Kind on my channel, and that is more appealing with a similar set of prescriptions, basically, to non-vegans, really. And they are essentially saying like, they even have like a get out of jail guilt-free card that you can purchase, right? And this is, you've given enough money that you've offset the animals that you're going to eat by not being vegan. So that's a little bit spicy and contentious. But if it is empirically true that doing this set of abstract things, i.e., purchasing meat and animal products, uh, affects X number of animals, and doing that set of abstract things, i.e., donating and doing activism, affects Y number of animals, and this number is bigger than that number. That's that's how I see it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that seems like kind of a utilitarian calculus where we're completely, I guess, ignoring the, at least as I see it, the definition of veganism as just basically being a doctrine that humans ought to live without exploiting other animals, and then it's just basically a normative doctrine, the way that I see it. So, I would kind of maybe try to push the margins of the idea that a person can be, let's say, vegan 2.0 while contributing to the use of animals. Like you said, there would be, I guess, some kind of calculus that would have to be made in terms of like how much exploitation they pay for as long as they donate a certain amount. Like how much exploitation could they be on a carnivore diet, for example, and if they're like, offsetting that with a certain amount of donations to like a welfarist organization. For one, I don't know why they would want to call themselves vegan, but I do see that as an issue. Like if somebody was like, well, I'm helping more animals than you, and they're not doing anything to affect the mindset that other animals are ours to use to exploit.
Yeah, so for me, the mindset will be an instrumental thing. That the reason why I would care about the mindset is because it is some variable in the equation of how many animals end up getting killed or how much animal suffering there is, right? So I don't think that the mindset in itself is something that is valuable. If there weren't any animals being farmed, I wouldn't care what mindset people had in that respect. I do care about the mindset, but only because it probably affects the animal suffering, which is what I actually care about. So that's what I would say. That's one distinction to make. Another thing is, I want to talk about the welfarism criticism. I think that
if we could maybe, sorry to cut you off there, but I think I just want to explore this aspect just a little bit more definitionally, because I think the welfare topic kind of
that's going to spiral off into a whole thing.
Yeah. So I appreciate your understanding there. So I guess I'm wondering, like, let's say that one day if I really missed the taste of eggs, for example, and I was like, I could make a tofu scramble with black salt, or I could have an avocado with black salt or whatever, but I'm just like, man, I just really miss that farty, eggy flavor of a henstration. And I'm like, okay, how can I consume this and still be vegan, still not change my whole social identity or whatever image of myself I've built up in my mind. So I guess like if I donated, like, let's say, I mean, I don't have $100,000 to donate, but let's say I did, and I donated $100,000 to some particular, let's say I determined like what would be the most effective animal charity to donate to, then could I eat that egg and, go to the shopping market, whatever, buy an egg, and still consider myself vegan? I guess would I no longer be vegan 1.0, but I would be 2.0 or something? I guess I'm just trying to understand like the delineation.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, the question in that situation seems to be like, would you not be vegan anymore? Which, I don't know, maybe like it's not that important really. Like if your behavior in the future is going to tend to want to help animals and reduce their suffering and not consume animal products, that's the important thing to me, rather than saying like, well, because you ate eggs on this day, now you're not called a vegan anymore, and how many months have to elapse before we let you back in the club, that sort of thing. Like, again, it's all kind of these abstracted things are like what we really care about is the animal suffering or the animal rights violations, right? So whether or not that one person who ate the one egg would still be considered a vegan is like, I don't know, maybe like I don't it doesn't matter, right? Could
Yeah.
they be vegan 2.0 if they, but to your point, right, if they gave a ton of money, could they be vegan 2.0? Yeah, 100%, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess if I could, so I guess my point was more the distinction between the 1.0 and the 2.0 thing. To me, I guess like my criticism would be that it kind of feels like you're trying to both raise and lower the bar simultaneously. And I don't know what we end up with in that case. I mean, like if the whole world became vegan 2.0, would animal liberation be a reality? To me, it doesn't seem that way. It seems like people would be absolving themselves of some kind of guilt, maybe, while convincing themselves that they were paying for animals to be helped. But it seems like the status quo could still persist, and may even be harder to eventually overcome. Like if we think about how, I guess it seems like, to kind of touch on the welfareism thing, it seems maybe segueing to that a little bit, like the welfarist organizations, I think I could see, and I don't know if they have these conversations, but I could definitely see them having conversations with animal exploiting industries where they try to convince the exploiters to maybe do these things to animals in a so-called more humane or humane appearing way because it'll help them sell more product. I could see them showing data to these companies saying, look, like the humane thing is on the rise, and why don't you switch to this, and then we'll give you a seal that you can put on your product that we approve these methods or something like that. But then animals still aren't liberated, and then we're having to move the goalposts if we continue pushing for vegan 1.0 now, right? Because it's like 2.0 can kind of max out with animals still being commodified.
Yeah, I see the kind of concern that you're getting at. I think basically you're basically right. It's contingent on other empirical facts. So, you know, vegan 2.0 wouldn't work under some conditions. It is the case that there are very effective charities, that there's a decent amount of evidence that they can help. 4 animals to the dollar is about the average of the estimates that I've seen. It is the case that there's a very small number of vegans currently. It is the case that most of us are in a position where we can spare $100 a month, and right, it wouldn't put us out of on the streets. Those things might not be the case in another world, right? It could be, there's actually, it turns out all animals charities are actually really, really ineffective, and it takes like $100 an animal to save one. And in that world, well, yeah, we should probably just get people to go vegan instead, right? Now, one of the things that's kind of a contingent empirical fact for the rest of this is that a lot of the interventions that we're paying for and giving money to campaigns and so on, it relies on somebody reducing their consumption.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so if everybody thought, well, I can just pay my, $100 a month or whatever it may be, and I don't have to go vegan, then it wouldn't work, right? Because then the $100, there would be an empirical factor in their change where actually that's not helping that many animals anymore because everyone's now living in this world. Yeah. And so I brought this up to the farm kind guy and said, is there this danger that you get so many people thinking, oh, I don't need to be vegan anymore? And he said, if we get to even 1% of people who are like, I don't need to be vegan because I'm giving my donations, we'll have so much resources that we will have already won. Like it'll be game over before we get to any appreciable scale of people who are genuinely doing the donating and offsetting the thing, because there might be a lot of people who bad faith say, oh, I could just do this donating and it would be helping more animals, or maybe they'll even lie and say that they are doing it, right? But to the extent, so those things are problems clearly, but to the extent that you do have you know, some budget that the farmed animal movement has, that budget could be 10x before you get to 1% of the population doing the donations. Yeah, we're going to be, we'll at some point the movement will have so many resources that there will be, you know, gay vegan ads on every single corner, and every ad on TV will be a Dominion ad and that kind of thing,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah. I mean, I think that's also kind of the crux of it, right? You know, the whole like personal behavior aspect of it aside, which, you know, I don't want to minimize, but just want to kind of like maybe drag the window to the side and just focus on this other part of the terrain, which is like that the donations aren't just this like nebulous entity, right? Like, you know, who we donate to, I think really matters. For example, if we're donating strictly to like an organization that's just trying to keep companies who have made so-called cage-free promises, you know, to their word, that's one, like for one, it's like a single issue, and it's definitely not achieving animal liberation and maybe assuaging, you know, the consciences of people who want to still eat eggs and believe that there's now a way to do so without cruelty. But I think that there are also instances of, like you mentioned, you know, the like Go Vegan ads or Watch Dominion type stuff. You know, I think that there needs to be, you know, for people who are donating to different charities and let's say pro animal organizations, there needs to be a very finely made calculation of where their money is best spent, whether is it donating to like Anonymous for the Voiceless, for example, and helping them empower like more groups to run cubes of truth. Is it, you know, donating to people's like individuals like Patreon accounts or that kind of thing, you know, and um, helping individual grassroots activists maybe make being an animal rights activist like their full-time job kind of thing. You know, there's also that element of
I,
like where the donation meets the pragmatic actual
yeah,
result.
yeah. I mean, I think that this is where the effective altruism part of it comes in, and you do need some sort of system of saying like, okay, you know, we accept that we can help more animals by donating money in the right places, and so let's assess what that might be, right? With most um, things that you might want to purchase, let's say, let's say that, like, you know, when we're giving to an animal charity, we're looking to purchase some alleviation in animal suffering, or purchase some reduction in animal consumption or production, whatever it may be. With most things that you want to purchase, it's kind of obvious to, or you can observe the quality of it, right? You know, when you buy something off Amazon, uh, well, hopefully, you know, before you buy it, right? And you can read reviews and stuff like that. Or when it comes, certainly you can observe it and say, okay, this is the thing that I wanted. I judged that it was worth this much money. It's well built, or it's not well built, whatever. You don't really have that when you're giving to charities. You just give the money and you hope that they do something good with it, but you don't get to see that. And from the organization side, if you're a business, if you're selling stuff on Amazon, you better make sure that your stuff's good, because people are going to find out if it's not, and they're going to give you bad reviews, and they're not going to buy from you again, and you're going to go out of business, right? So if you're not doing well the thing that people are giving you money to do, that's going to become obvious very quickly, and you're not going to be doing the thing very well. But that's not the case in charities, right? It's a unique organization. It's not like a regular business, because the part that generates the money, which, you know, there's salaried people working in charities, there's bills to pay, there's, right, the charities need to have cash flow. The part that generates the money is completely different from the part that actually does the thing that the organization is meant to be doing. Right? In a business, you're selling your widgets, and if your widgets are good, you make more money, and it's, you know, it has a feedback mechanism built in. But if you're running a charity, you are making, you know, you're getting your money over here in your donations department, whatever, donor relations, right? and then you're doing your campaigns over here, and hopefully that's doing what you want it to be doing. Hopefully it's helping animals. Really, what it can end up being is that you're doing the campaigns that your particular donors like and want to see and want to fund, and they might not know what's effective, right? That's just like asking someone on the street, what do you reckon would be a good thing to put on a vegan poster? Maybe someone really likes cats and now they want to give to the cat charity, right? We need to take this out of the hands of like the ill-informed donor market, right? Where we just kind of look at things and say, maybe that's effective, maybe that's effective. We don't know, do we? Right? There's no mechanism for us to verify that. There is, as it turns out, organization that will do it for us, and that has full-time people making all these assessments and going into the details of, like, when if I give to someone on Patreon, I have no idea what they're going to do with that money, like how much they needed that money, whether it affects, whether they weren't going to be able to do activism if I wasn't giving them that money, right? There's all sorts of things to consider that we just don't have access to that information. But
maybe they'll just
so that's why
buy
I think
a
things
new
like
couch or something.
well, exactly, yeah, and people need couches, right? And activists need to put food on the table. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that, like, there should be some sort of mechanism for paying activists to live, right? And there is, right? And people get employed as campaigners and stuff like that. But the point is that you want to know that the thing that your money is going to is running a process that is going to use that money well to turn it into, in this case, reduced animal exploitation or reduced animal suffering.
Did you say that there is an organization that kind of looks at?
Yeah. So Animal Charity Evaluators is the one that I refer to, and they do what they say on the tin, right? But they'll do evaluations of which programs are the most effective. That's why you see so much cage-free stuff, because there's been studies that show that's, a high number of animals help to the dollar, basically. So you get a lot of charities doing that because there's demand for it in the effective altruism donor space. Which, yeah, you let me know when you want to go on to welfareism. But one point I always like to make on that: the main beneficiaries of welfare policies are not necessarily the animals who now have better conditions than they did before, right? It's about increasing the cost of farming animals so that fewer animals are farmed overall, right? So animals are going to be farmed in as cheap a way as the farmers can get away with. And until there's regulation that will stop that, right, welfare laws, they will do it as cheaply as they can get away with. Now, if you have some law that says you're not allowed to use cages anymore, it's got to be cage free, that's going to make it more expensive, and that's going to mean that fewer animals are farmed, and it's going to make, like, plant-based alternatives more competitive, right, if the animal products get more expensive. So that is really the main important benefit of welfare policies. It's not about saying, like, oh, it's acceptable to farm chickens as long as the cage is big enough. You can take the welfare improvement and then keep pushing for more. It doesn't have to be that's where it stops. But we should push for and take every welfare improvement that we can get, because if we do ever get to a vegan world, it will be because animal farming gradually became less and less feasible. And part of that will be there were too many regulations and people just couldn't afford to do it anymore. If we don't have that, like, we're not going to get there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I see where you're kind of making that calculation with, making it more expensive for the producers. I think that, there is something to be said for the fact that people's consciences can be eased, though, if they think that these systems have been sufficiently reformed. Because I think there are, we don't want to underestimate how informed the average consumer is, nor should we bank on people being uninformed or misinformed. Not to say that you are, but I mean, not say that you're implying that, but when, if we think about, like, a scenario where there's, let's say, like, a way found of killing animals painlessly, and they're given the best possible conditions, etc. Like, even though this is kind of a little bit far-fetched because it's not scalable, to imagine this situation where animals are just being treated magnificently. But let's say we get kind of this combination of, like, maybe the human population growth slowing down a little bit, animal product consumption reducing drastically, but like there still being a pretty strong contingent of the population who's still exploiting animals for food. It would be it would be a higher, like steeper hill to climb, I think, if we had this kind of situation where we were having to argue on the basis of rights. And I don't think that I do see that there's this kind of schism that my commentary is kind of like jumping over, in that like it's already the case that animals are being exploited and abused for these products. And I can see, the temptation or seduction of the position, like, well, if it's going to be happening anyway, why don't we just do it in a slightly better way? And it could even be, I could even be accused of almost like instrumentalizing the egregious suffering of animals as the status quo currently stands in order to get people to go vegan, right? But so that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying like, hey, don't make things better for animals, because if you do, then I'm going to have a harder job getting people to go vegan. It's more that I think we get what we ask for, is what I'm saying, or at least we should ask for what we want. I think if we advocate for abolition of the use of animals, we're likely to get welfareism anyway.
There's something to be said for that. There is like just a point about negotiation where you put out like a higher offer than you hope to end up with. Certainly, but I think a key thing that I always struggle with is we don't have the big green button. We don't have the big green make the world go vegan now button. So all we have is incrementalism, right? We don't. We can talk about doing vegan activism, and you could say we can't get everyone to go vegan, so it's pointless. Like, okay, but we can still actually get some people to go vegan, and it's going to be a gradual process, right? It's the same with welfare improvements. It's going to be, we don't have the big green button, the big green abolitionist, let's end it all now. And so our only alternative is to gradually try and push things on the demand side, so that people are, fewer people are willing to pay for animal exploitation, and also simultaneously push things on the supply side, so that there are. I do think that better welfare standards are important, by the way, as well, right? There is the point about we're raising the price of production, and therefore we're reducing the number of animals. I think that's the main point that abolitionists would want to see. But I do think it's also important that animals are going to be in better conditions than worse conditions, right?
Yeah. If I could say, from a perspective of someone who does street outreach often and has, probably dozens of conversations per week, I think that maybe on a good week, but anyway, if somebody does approach the conversation from a perspective of them being like, I try to buy the humanely raised and the cage free, etc., they are a little bit more primed for the message that I'm delivering to them.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so I do think that it does kind of like serve as a little bit of a priming mechanism if somebody has these kind of like welfare concerns in their mind. For me, that was also something like before I stopped eating animals, I would occasionally be at the store thinking like, I could pay a little bit more for this like cage-free pasture-raised egg versus this like factory farmed one. And I would feel a little bit guiltier. I'd feel a little bit scummier if I bought just like the cheap, 99-cent dozen of eggs instead of the 3.29 one or something like that.
Sure.
But so I do see some value in, I guess, priming the psychology of people to at least consider anything about the victims behind those choices. My kind of position on welfareism, in the past, I've kind of wasted probably too much energy fighting it. And I think right now I'm at a point where I don't see it as a good use of my energy to try to get in the way of people doing pro-welfarist activism, because there are people making all sorts of ridiculous, nonsensical claims, and completely disregarding. I mean, there's people who say that plants feel pain, right? And the entailment of that is that if there's a house burning, they're going to go in and save the petunias maybe instead of Fido or something like that.
Right,
So,
right.
I mean, and there's people who are just like, I just don't care. I want my bacon. But then there's also people everywhere in between. And I'd rather, I'm not saying I want to waste my time getting into rhetorical battles with people who are just not open to change at all. But yeah, I think that, if we just zoom out kind of from a big historical context, if there are some people whose approach may not make the most sense to me pragmatically, as long as I don't think that it's injuring the vegan movement. Heck, I mean, I talked very briefly on Discord once with Gary Francione, who's like kind of the father of the abolitionist approach. And I asked him straight up, I said, like, can somebody consider themselves an abolitionist? Or I think I said a vegan and a welfarist. I think were the two things that I put forward. And he said, yeah. I mean, and this is the guy who, again, is kind of like the prominent abolitionist approach figure. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily incompatible. And like I said, it's not. I recognize that energy is a finite resource. It's not the best use of my time to try to get in the way of people doing pro welfare stuff. I hope that some good comes of it. It's just not where I would put my energy. Like I would never, the social experiments that I run live. I would never be out trying to convince people that if they're buying like caged eggs that they should go cage free. And kind of like, to allude to what you were saying earlier about the donors kind of wanting to follow and see what their money is actually doing. In effect, I think that probably a lot of the organizations who do focus on cage free type stuff would probably rather be doing other things, but they're kind of almost like politicians in a way where
Yeah.
their opinions have been bought basically and preordained.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a bit more of a cynical framing than I thought you were going to end at. But yeah, I mean,
I'm a bit of a cynical guy. What can I say?
fair enough, fair enough.
Idealistic but cynical.
Yeah, listen, I mean, people whose job it is to work in a non-profit and that pays their rent. Like, obviously, at the end of the day, you have to do what the funders are going to give you money to do, because otherwise, you got to get another job, right? So, but I think that there are people. It's not that they've just been bought out by some funders, right? They probably, like you and I, think ideally we wouldn't be farming any animals at all, but they recognize that it's a pragmatic thing to move towards that goal, to do whatever reduction you can. Like, people are really allergic to the word reduction, but reducing includes the amount to zero. Right, getting to zero animals farmed would be a reduction in the number of animals farmed. We're
Well,
all going
also,
in the same direction.
yeah, and to be fair, I mean, so I'm actually more of a proponent of reductionism than I am of welfarism, because I think reductionism, at least like from a quantitative perspective, is on the same scale of veganism, or let's say vegan 1.0, where like I said with the gas station bathroom example kind of thing, if I use that soap, I'm probably taking myself a little above some higher number, not to say I'm at zero, but just a greater than the greater than zero number that already exists. So yeah, I think, and to get to the heart of it, if we want to see zero across the board, because I think ultimately the goal of vegan 2.0, as you call it, kind of circles back, I would think, to the goal of vegan 1.0, which is to get zero societally, right?
Yes, that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, vegan 1.0 talks about a lifestyle that excludes exploitation and suffering. I'm reading the implication as like from my life, right? From my lifestyle.
Yeah,
Yeah, you
not
could say at a
necessarily
societal
lifestyle.
level.
I guess we could say lifestyle. I don't know if you found this too, but some people I think also use that term to kind of malign veganism and just be like, oh, it's a lifestyle, and it kind of
It makes
implies
it seem
like,
quite optional. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
yeah, yeah. But I think just, the doctrine that we ought to live without exploiting other animals, like, just seeing them as individuals. And assigning, I'm not actually a moral realist, so I don't believe in like the objective existence of rights necessarily. I think they are, contrived. But it's kind of my position that I believe that it's a good idea to act as though rights exist, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
it's just it's a little nuanced, but it does bear out in conversation because people will talk about all sorts of things like might makes right and things like that, and kind of talk about whether rights actually even mean anything when the rubber meets the road and the oppressor is exerting power. So I just say, it's a good idea to behave as though rights exist.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good way of thinking about it. I've thought the same thing about, I guess this is a type of right, but like owning stuff. My friend said to me, when you own a car, there's nothing that changes in the physical universe. Not like there's now some invisible chain between you and the car, right? It's just you transferred some money to someone, there was some paperwork changed. I mean, it will when it comes down to it. If somebody steals the car, it will be me that the police come and right act on behalf of, whatever. But there's in some sense nothing has changed. But exactly as you're saying, it benefits us all in society to behave as though something has changed. And if we all agree to behave as though something has changed, then something has in fact changed because now is my door that the police are going to come to when the car gets stolen, right? So
Yeah.
it's like is it like intersubjective, whereas like it's not quite an objective reality, but it is true with respect to what everyone else thinks is true. Like Christmas is the
Right.
25th of December. Like it's only true because everyone else thinks it's true, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, even calendars and clocks and all that stuff, we've agreed that, heck, I don't know, it's like it's the year 2025, whatever. What does that mean?
Right.
Um, I think something else that I think about, oh man, I lost my train of thought there. We were talking about ownership rights. Totally lost it. Man, I just took my B12 too.
One thing
uh,
I was going to
yeah,
say, there is an empirical point. I appreciate what you said about the people who come up and say, "Well, I try to get cage-free eggs or whatever, high welfare stuff." You see them as actually more likely to be amenable to the vegan message, and that's an interesting perspective because we often worry that those people might be less likely because they think, "Oh, I'm getting cage-free; it doesn't matter; it's fine now." But I see what you're saying because it's like they've already made a concession that the animal's experience matters to some extent. And actually, there's a
yeah,
similar thing in some corporate communications about like cage free, for example. A lot of companies are like quite hesitant to communicate about it because it's essentially saying like I've stopped doing that thing that was horrific and I shouldn't have been doing. It's
right,
like you don't necessarily want to make that, that big of an announcement because
yeah,
a lot of consumers don't realize that like, oh, what? So before this week, all your eggs were coming from cages, were they? Do you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
from
yeah.
a PR perspective, yeah.
Especially because these things take time to implement. So they're like, by 2027. So people are like, okay, so I have to be, paying for
Right.
the
But the
crueler
good thing
ones.
is now it's gotten to the stage with cage free. It's very much like this S curve adoption because you'll get a sort of domino effect in the industry where enough others doing it. You know, if you're the CEO of Burger King, you don't want to be the only one not doing cage free, right? If everyone else has done it, now you're going to be behind, and that actually becomes a basis for you to be criticized. And that's a really interesting thing that works with respect to legal changes as well, right? Let's say that there's cages for chickens are legal in the US, right? Um, and now, if you get enough, and food companies in general are going to lobby to keep that the case because they're using cages and it is profitable to do so, right? But if you get enough companies on board with voluntary commitments, and now they are going to have their supply chains cage free or whatever it may be, their incentives when they go into those lobbying meetings have completely changed because now they're not saying, well, we use cages, we want to keep cages allowed for that reason. They're saying, we don't use cages. Our competitors do use cages. They've got an unfair advantage now. So we actually want the regulation to catch up to where we are and enforce everyone to not use cages because we're already not doing it. It's not fair if others get to do it, right? So that's kind of the dynamic of how these things change and how um, government policy can end up following on from like private certifications and like private policies like that, because it just changes the incentives of the companies when they go into those meetings.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from on that, and I think part of that also factors in this idea of social pressure. Like if the cultural mood, I guess, shifts toward more consideration for animals. I think something else that it's important to realize is kind of riding along this is this increased sense of hypocrisy on the part of people who, let's say Chick-fil-A or let's say Chick-fil-A. I don't know if they do a cage free or not kind of thing with the chickens they sell, but um, if they do, for example, and somebody goes there and they're eating a chicken who they know was raised not in a cage, um, the defenses that they may have to continue eating the chicken unnecessarily might be a little bit closer to the surface of conscious awareness and might bother them a little bit more, might prompt them a little bit more to rehearse or tell themselves the messages that they tell themselves to justify the continued eating of the animal. Does that make sense? Like, something that I always do if somebody says, I've gone to cage free is I'll ask them like why, which
Mm,
kind of catches people off guard all the time because they're like, what do you mean why? Like you're the vegan guy. What do you mean? And I'm like, no, like why? Like because it's just about, exploring that person's value framework. And
that's really good.
yeah, I think
But yeah,
that dissonance I think just becomes a little bit louder. So Chris, I wanna ask if it's okay with you if anybody watching maybe has any questions for you while we have you on.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, feel free to fire them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll just say like I agree with that approach, and that's what I would do for like reducitarians or vegetarians as well. It's like uh yeah, invite them to reflect on what has caused them to do the stuff that they've done so far, basically. Um yeah, have
Yeah.
them ponder on that and communicate it and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say with vegetarians, I've had a little bit more difficulty because I think there is a little bit of like an identity buy-in with that, where there's a little bit of like this identity of being like a pro animal person kind of a thing.
Mm,
Like, and I know that a lot of people, including myself, as I did, will go vegan after some time of just not eating animal flesh. So I don't know if it's necessarily effective or a good idea to just rag on vegetarians, to promote veganism. But my approach with vegetarians is a little bit different. Like generally, if somebody says that they're vegetarian, they'll kind of have a little bit of a sense of entitlement or ego or arrogance about it, and already will be a little bit defensive and say, I'm not the target audience, I'm not the person you should be talking to, and that kind of thing. And what I found often makes that defensiveness worse is when vegans then will say like, well, what do you know about the dairy industry? Which I think that's a magnificent question, but I think maybe it's better at that point if somebody says they're vegetarian to ask them how they feel about something like the fur industry. These like slightly lower hanging fruits that they're not like clinging onto necessarily or likely, and
mm,
then kind of explore their values, because I think a lot of people when they go vegetarian, they don't they either do it with an ill-informed or not completely informed set of values, or set of, I guess, information, or just without having explored their moral values at all. So I think like if somebody can get to the point where you get a vegetarian interlocutor to be like, oh, I'm against the fur industry because we don't need to be killing animals for their fur, then I think it's something that can be effective to then circle back to the equally unnecessary dietary consumption.
yeah, that's a really good point. Getting people to, yeah, fur is a great one because like it's so optional. No one needs to have fur. It's not something that it's not a hill that many people are going to want to die on, right?
Yeah. All right. So let me scroll up and see. I think we might have had some questions. Um, Earlier, Lewis said vegan 2.0 might be a weird one, but I guess that's not exactly a question.
Elwood has cage-free dog eggs.
I don't know. Dog eggs seem like they would be a little bit harder to procure. Daniel Broccoli had said maybe vegan 2.0 is loving your enemies. Interesting.
Hmm.
Okay, let's see. I think I saw something from Lewis where he said, okay, so under vegan 2.0, if you can get a vegan chair with no more difficulty than a leather chair, but you help two piranhas to be more comfortable, then it's okay to buy the leather chair. Vomit emoji.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if I get. I think it's like a trade-off thing, like would it justify kind of thing. I mean, the gist of what you're saying, yeah. I mean, I don't say that buying the leather chair is okay in any case. What I would say is if you have somebody who can take one set of abstract actions that is going to save X number of animals, or take another set of abstract actions that's going to save Y number of animals, I am just going to say which which is bigger, X or Y, and go with that basically. Right now, there is going to be, as I said, a limit at some point where you can't have everybody thinking that they can just do their donations and now that they don't need to reduce their consumption anymore. So it will get to that point, but I think we're a long way from that point. And if the fact is that I can get someone to either do something that's going to save 100 animals a year if they go vegan, and it's much more difficult to get them to do that, or I can get them to give some amount of animals and save 10,000 animals a year, uh, and that's going to be much easier to get them to do that, then I'm going to tend to do the one that is going to save more animals and be easier to do. And yeah, that's not to say that you shouldn't be doing both ideally, but ultimately, I'm just going to be concerned with the number of animals that are helped or the amount of animal suffering.
Chris, I wanted to ask you something. Maybe in the meantime, if anybody's still thinking of questions to send in. So you mentioned animal suffering, and that's a topic that I think I've been moving away from a little bit as I get clearer on my kind of moral philosophy. Because, for example, I'm a huge proponent of rewilding. Like I want, if we think about, and obviously you don't need to be informed of these statistics, I'm sure, but like just the sheer amount of farmland, both for animal farming and for plant farming, that's there for the farming of animals for that system. If we think about all of that land, if we switch to a plant-based food system, we're going to have a lot of land freed up. There's going to be huge swaths of land that we could devote to rewilding. Getting forests and things like that back. The lungs of the earth and all this. And I think that potentially that could result in more suffering. Now, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure if there would necessarily, if a forest would be teeming with life more than with sentient life, I should say, more than like a cornfield, for example, that's just dedicated to animal food, feed growing operations. But theoretically, I think it's plausible that it would, if we had like a big forest, I think that more sentient life would eventually kind of like find their way there, emerge there. Um, and these would be animals likely who would be trying to kind of like get like the so-called sovereign animals, the animals who would be kind of like trying to get away from human civilizations more, like not like necessarily animals who seek out human settlements because they can kind of like benefit from humans like on the margins. But yeah, I guess this kind of brings up the idea of like the suffering of so-called wild animals, um, which I kind of want nothing to do with, like that whole equation. Um, and not because I'm a fan of appealing to nature, but because the logical entailments of wanting to intervene in that context um, are terrifying when you put them in a human context. Like, um, in other words, like if it's another way to say what I'm saying is like if it's speciesist to say that I would prefer to not protect non-human animals from suffering in the wild, um, while holding a position that I would protect humans from predation, or I would want to protect humans from predation. I think people who adopt that position but then want to police other species of animals without policing humans like to the same standard are also equally guilty of speciesistic notions. If that makes sense, like, if you hold the position that um, non-human animal on non-human animal violence is something that we should stop with force, even to the extent of like shooting a lion if they're about to kill and eat a zebra, um, it really kind of begs the question about how that person would feel toward non-vegan humans, or maybe more accurately, anti-vegan humans.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say anti-vegan humans who had written in blood that they'll never go vegan,
Yeah.
or even if you just pose a hypothetical, like imagine this person's never going to go vegan. They're going to live 40 more years exploiting tons of animals. Like, what do you think should happen to this person?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it, I truly believe that violence begets violence. And if we're intervening in the so-called natural world with violence, I think it's a very, very close, not to make a slippery slope fallacy, but I really just think it's like just very close to a situation where we could have people trying to justify like violence toward anti-vegans, let's say.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, first of all, the whole wild animal thing, I do think that it's worth caring about wild animals. And the way that I think about it is I care about humans who are affected by war, like some human caused thing that other humans could stop doing the war and then they wouldn't be affected by it. But I also care about humans who are affected by like earthquakes or tsunamis or whatever, like natural disasters. So that feels like the analogous thing to me. It doesn't have to be some other group of humans who are causing the suffering in order to think that I could do something to alleviate it, right?
I don't think it's analogous though,
Okay.
um, because I mean, this is kind of like basically trying to defend somebody from some kind of a perpetrator in either example. Um, it's
Okay, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Well, so you're making an analogy to like, could you basically the uncomfortable question becomes like, could you use violence towards non-vegan humans on the basis that they're going to uh, hurt animals, right?
I see that as the question that we ought to ask people who are um, against predation in the wild,
Hmm.
and who are willing to basically intervene using violence, right?
Yeah,
Because it's like, because I feel like I feel again like I feel like if somebody's willing to use violence to prevent violence, then you have to ask them like where they draw their line. Who is potentially subjectable to that.
yeah. Well, I would think about it as um, we essentially already do use violence to prevent violence towards some animals, right? You're not allowed to kill and eat dogs in my country. And if you do that, a man with a gun's going to come around your house and tell you to bloody well stop it, right? We do have laws around treatment of animals that you can be prosecuted for animal cruelty, right? People who work on farms get prosecuted for animal cruelty. Um, this is like state violence, really, right? It is, there's going to be the police force come and sort you out if you do these things that we've agreed you're not allowed to do. And really, by like expanding welfare laws, for example, you're kind of just slightly expanding the circumstances in which you're going to say we do now deem it acceptable ultimately to use violence to enforce this
Yeah,
certain
that's a
rule.
very interesting perspective.
Yeah, that is like, yeah, anything that is illegal, you're basically saying we're willing to use violence to stop you from doing this. Ultimately, if the rubber meets the road, right, we're going to try
Hmm.
and arrest you or fine you or whatever first.
Yeah.
But
Or as we say in the US, dollars to donuts.
right, right. Yeah. So I think there's lots of yeah, I think basically such a person could say, well, yes, ideally I would use violence to stop non-vegan humans, but essentially it's not pragmatic to do that, right? It's not if you go out on the street and start slashing up non-vegans, right, you're going to find out why you can't do that pretty quickly. Um, but ultimately, you'd be looking to say we're going to try and persuade enough people and convince enough people and vote for it, right? Just like we voted that you're not allowed to eat dogs, we're going to eventually, hopefully, vote that you're not allowed to eat pigs. And when we do that, it will be essentially inflicting violence on people who break that rule.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why, I really try to emphasize the mindset shift. I would hate to have, a situation where the majority of humans kind of like vote in certain types of animal saving measures, even though I guess that's kind of like where we're ultimately going to have to see things go, whether I'm alive to see it or not. It's going to be incremental, but I would really just hope that it would, and this is where me being an idealist comes in, but I would just really hope that eventually people could grow up in a world that conditions them to make excuses to care about others, including others other than human animals, rather than, making excuses to hurt them. I want to check out this question from Jeremy. He says, I tend to think that foundational moral improvement of humans, let me put it on the screen here, um, and human cultures in the near future is the largest moral priority. Foundational moral improvement. What do you think about the means of making humanity broadly? And yeah, I guess this is really just kind of touching on what I was just saying too.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's a good approach. It's a very meta approach. This is very like effective altruism thing to talk about. I mean, I sometimes think of it as, I think I said earlier in this conversation, like what kind of process are you running? Are you running a process that is going to tend to buy more eggs in the future? Or are you running a process that is going to not tend to buy more eggs in the future? That's how a lot of things are really. Like when you look at effective charities, you're essentially saying, what kind of processes are they running? Are they going to be running a process that tends to produce these results, right? And we've got probably some evidence from data from 1 year when they did this a few years ago, and hopefully we look at other things to say that they're running a similar process now, and so it's probably going to be similarly effective. But to the point about like broadly getting more people to think that they ought to care about being moral and doing it effectively, I think that is going to be something like the ultimate variable that is going to predict uh you know the amount of suffering or well-being in the future one day. So yeah, I mean that's kind of like what Vegan 2.0 is trying to persuade people to go more vegan, and yeah, trying to basically grow the movement and yeah, increase. People talk about expanding the moral circle of moral concern, right? So yeah, definitely on board with that.
I think that it's also important when we think about welfareism as a whole and kind of like charities and the pragmatic approaches of the charities to, I mean, investigations are great, but I think we need to kind of like maintain a message. So I think like whether it's welfareism or single issues, it's possible to promote those combinationally or concurrently with a vegan message. And I think like, if if these organizations have any leeway whatsoever when it comes to like satisfying donors and having the donors see that their money that they spend is going toward what they wanted it to go toward. I think that these organizations have a responsibility to try to maximize that ceiling, or to try to kind of like get in as much pro-vegan messaging along with whatever welfareism or reducitarianism thing or whatever like individual investigation. Like there was this whole thing with, I think it was called Fair Oaks Farms, like the Fair Life milk people, I think, and they were like in these videos, these people were like tossing calves around and beating them over the head with jugs and stuff like that. And I still hear about this to this day, and this was years ago when this investigation came out. And this was like thought to be kind of one of the higher welfare types of dairy operations, if you will. But it's like what I really kind of find a little bit disillusioning is that non-vegans will gladly boycott like a specific company who an investigation happens to be released on, but fail to see or appreciate the very real possibility that they're paying for even worse treatment of cows, for example.
Yeah. So are you saying something like there's a danger of making it as if this is an isolated incident? Is that the kind of...
Yeah, not only that, but more so I'm kind of trying to highlight the idea that these pro welfare or pro reducitarian types of campaigns, if you will, or even like just single issue campaigns advocating for the boycott of fur, let's say, things like that. I think that vegans should absolutely kind of like take our liberty to try to inject as much big tent veganism ideas within that, whether or not the individual participants agree necessarily with everything. I think that we shouldn't let the lowest common denominator participant or donor, when I say lowest common denominator, I mean like morally speaking, kind of like control all of the messaging, and I would think that they'd still be happy to come along with the overall campaign, would still be happy to donate. I don't think they would call somebody up and be like, yo, I really love that non-cage egg campaign that you did with the money that I sent you, but could you tone down the vegan messaging? Like, I don't think that would be a possibility. I think that...
Yeah, it depends,
yeah.
right? I mean, so spending money doing vegan messaging will have, save some number of animals per dollar spent. I don't know what that number is. Hopefully you can try and do more effective vegan messaging. It's going to increase that number. You save more animals per dollar spent, but it might still be way less than the animals that you save by spending money on cage-free campaigns. It just might be. You just have like supply and demand curves that meet, and that's how many eggs get made. And if you shift the demand curve, you can reduce the number of eggs getting made by doing that. And if you shift the supply curve, you can reduce the number of eggs getting made by doing that. And it just can be the case that shifting the supply curve reduces the number more than shifting the demand curve. For me, it's just an empirical question as to which of those is more effective. And it seems like the people who have done the research think that the supply side stuff is saving more animals to the dollar. So
well, the whole supply, I was going to say, sorry, the whole supply side thing is also just very convoluted because of subsidies and bailouts and tax breaks and that kind of stuff. I don't know if it's like that in the UK as well, but in the US, I mean, the price of eggs, let's say, goes up and everybody's freaking out. Then the government steps in, tries to get the price down. How do they do that?
Yeah, but they don't have infinite money to do that, right? If the price of eggs is high, then the price of eggs is high, and the government can choose to allocate some of their limited budget towards subsidizing eggs if they want to, but they've got lots of other demands on their limited budget, and they might not necessarily want to raise taxes so the eggs can get cheaper, right? Like there can be subsidies, there can be like other things, but there's a cost to doing that, right? They don't get to do that for free, and they don't get to do it forever.
Can't they just print more money?
Not really. There are consequences of doing that. Governments have limited resources, just as we all do, and they might choose to spend some of that subsidizing the price of eggs, but they might not. There's a lot of other stuff that they need to spend money on. If it was the case that like all of the supply side stuff can just be immediately undone by some subsidies or whatever it might be, to the extent that actually doing the supply side stuff is not impactful at all, I would want to know about that, and I would want to stop advocating for doing any supply side stuff, because I'd say, well, that's a waste of resources that we could be putting towards something more impactful, right? But if I was funding supply side stuff because I've looked at evidence and that says that supply side stuff's the most effective, and then I found out that some of the money I thought I was giving to that was going to demand side stuff just because somebody thought that was cool. Like, I don't know, I'd stop funding that because I'd be like, well, I wanted to go to the more impactful stuff. So I don't think, we can't just appropriate, the funders might have their reasons for funding whatever they want to fund. But if they are wanting to fund cage-free stuff because they feel that that's the most impactful, I don't think we have good reason to think that it would actually be way more impactful if they would fund this other thing. If we did have good reason to think that, I mean, we should go to the funders and present the evidence and say, why don't you fund this other thing instead, right? But we can't just be roguely pilfering off the funds.
Yeah. The whole supply side part I've found is kind of a little bit discouraging, I think, to think about, as an activist who focuses most on helping people align, their values with their consumption. I think that, just to think that Congress can pass a bill that just completely wipes out your whole lifetime of effort, I think is really discouraging. But so I guess I'll tell myself that there are limited resources, I guess, in order to keep myself optimistic. I want to highlight this comment from Jeremy here. It says, if a man says he doesn't harm his kids by beating them, you don't say kids being harmed has nothing to do with the definition of anti-beatingism. You say, yes, you are fucking harming them. I'm not sure I understand. If a man says he doesn't harm his kids by beating them, doesn't harm his kids by beating them, I think he means so the man is beating his kids, but he's saying it's not harming them. You don't say that kids being harmed has nothing to do with.
I think this is when we were talking about. I imagine this is when we were talking earlier about would you still be vegan in some situation? Like, I think I could be wrong. I think the point they're making there is like, the label is not really the important thing. It's the outcome. It's the harm. I see. I might have misunderstood the comment there.
So he has Jeremy has another comment here. Could Chris comment on the impact on sentient experience relative to animal size? Ooh, that's
yeah, this is definitely an effective altruism person. Nice.
And the danger. So Jeremy is, I believe, very consequentialism oriented. I had a really long conversation with Jeremy, actually, like maybe a year or so ago, on my channel. If you ever wish to check it out, he has some pretty insightful takes on things.
Nice.
But the danger of environmental message cause being vastly more chicken torture. Sorry. My brain is starting to slide a little bit here.
That's all right. We've been going a good hour and a half, so fair play. So this is about something called the small body problem. Essentially, one cow can yield about 200 meals worth of meat, but one chicken can yield about 2 meals worth of meat. And so subsequently, in order to get the same number of meals from chickens, you need to kill 100 times as many of them as you would to get the same number of meals from a cow.
But then there's this other aspect here about like the environmental thing, like people switching from cows to chickens, for example, like, oh, we need to prevent the cow burps and farts, that kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah. So I think that's where there can be a divergence with the environmentalist. If you were strictly an environmentalist and you were trying to kind of maximize for that, you would prioritize cutting out red meat and actually dairy. And if you were an animal suffering person, or animal welfare person, whatever, you would want to prioritize cutting out chicken and fish and eggs, because small body problem, right? So from small bodied animals, you need more of them to produce the same amount of food, and also they tend to be treated worse, just because it's, you can't really throw around a cow to the same extent as you can a chicken, right? So yeah, that's definitely a thing to be concerned with, and a point where animal people can diverge from environmentalists. But the ultimate answer for each of them is to be vegan. So
Yeah. All right, Chris. Well, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to highlight that. Thank you for joining me here, and thank you to everybody who participated in the chat. I think this was a constructive conversation. Thanks to VPM for connecting us in this manner through SoyFeed. And if you haven't checked out SoyFeed, check out SoyFeed. And yeah, I don't know what time it is there, but I think probably like 6:15ish p.m., right?
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Here it's just quarter afternoon, so still got a whole day ahead of me, but hope you have a good evening. Thanks to everybody who joined, and yeah, I think this gave me a little bit to think about, just in terms of like the demand side and the supply side, and kind of thinking about, I guess, how I can kind of, like, I hate to use this word, maybe benefit the animals. I was going to say capitalize, but just benefit the animals, kind of in light of the efforts that that welfarism is making, rather than seeing it as necessarily oppositional.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. If we can do a nice, like, if you take anything from this conversation, let it be this, right? There are the two groups who are most opposed to welfare improvements, like welfare laws, let's say, are going to be vegans who don't understand the supply and demand stuff and don't understand that actually reduces the number of animals, and factory farmers. Right, those are going to be the two groups who are most animated in their opposition to welfare laws. And so I think that it's a great trick if the factory farmers can get some percentage of vegans opposed to welfare improvements, because they don't quite understand that it's basically pointing in the same direction as what they're trying to achieve. And again, they've done a great job if they can get vegans fighting with each other and saying you're the welfarists and we're the abolitionists or whatever else, right? The reality is we're getting on the same bus 99% of the way. And in fact, I'm coming 100% of the way, right? But I'm just recognizing that we've got to do the 99% of the way in order to get to the 100% of the way. So, yeah, we ought to be pulling in the same direction. Even abolitionists ought to be in favor of welfare improvements because they reduce the number of animals being farmed. And I think that, fortunately, it seems like largely that whole schism is not really a thing as much as it used to be. That's more like the old animal movement, where there was this big wedge, which again will have been amplified by industry interests. So yeah, I think that welfarists should also be vegans, and I think that vegans should also be welfarists. I think we're pushing in the same direction, and we should understand how that works together. And yeah.
Yeah, I think also when we do the pro veganism outreach, I think it's important to, if we're getting a lot of agreement from a non-vegan, or if there's a non-vegan who happens to be particularly thoughtful and not just agreeing for the sake of agreeing, but actually thoughtfully thinking, agreeing, I think there's value in asking them how they would respond to different criticisms of, like, an abolitionist position, and ask them what they would think about just the idea of bigger cages or free range, that kind of thing, just to get people used to opposing those as an end goal, right? So I think there's a way to appreciate the role that they can play as a means to a vegan future without endorsing them, or even while stating that these aren't exactly aligned with the definition of non-exploitation.
Exactly. Yeah. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to say that that's enough, right? It doesn't have to say if we did this, it'd be enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Chris, for your
Yeah.
time.
Thanks so much for having me on. I
Go
appreciate
ahead
it.
and wrap up the stream here. And yeah, thanks again. Thanks again for coming. Thanks again to everybody watching, whether you're watching live or on the replay. And this has been a good conversation. So thank you again.
All right. Take
All
care,
right.
dude. Speak soon.